Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarita Bashalieva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anara. It's my pleasure to introduce to week 232 of MUkraine discussion panel our contributor, Dr. Yuri Yarim-Agaev from New Jersey, with a presentation titled Many Dimensions of the Ukraine War. Dr. Yarim-Agaev is known to our viewers. He is a president of Transcom International and Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and a scientist, economist, human rights activist who was a key member many years ago of the Moscow Helsinki Group and the leader of the human rights movement in Russia, working closely with Andrei Sakharov and other dissidents. Dr. Yarim-Agaev, please, microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. 1 second, please. I'll set my computer. So I called my presentation Many Dimensions of Ukraine's War, simply to emphasize that both the development and the final outcome of Ukraine's war depend on many factors. And they include definitely the situation on the battlefield, the state of Russian army, but also what happens in Ukraine as a country as a whole and with its people, what happens inside Russia and with Putin regime, Ukraine's and Russia's domestic politics, Russia's economic situation, and also the political situation in the United States and Western Europe. And the most critical factor is geopolitics in general, how it changes and how these changes will influence the further development of the war in Ukraine. I want to start with two positions that I stated at the outset of this war, actually even before the war started. My first statement is that Ukraine will win this war. And the second is that this war is part of the global ideological war waged by a united totalitarian bloc against the free world, and first and foremost against the United States. My position at that time was met with criticism and disbelief. As to Ukraine's victory, many people believe that if Russia invaded Ukraine, there was no question that its overwhelming military superiority would allow it to take over the whole country within few days or perhaps a week. Many people therefore said that my statement that Ukraine could win was actually absurd. There was similar criticism, or perhaps more accurately misunderstanding, of my statement that this war was part of a global war. Most Western politicians did not see that we were dealing with a totalitarian bloc confronting us. They considered this local war between Russia and Ukraine. They did not relate it to other totalitarian countries such as China, Iran, or North Korea, and they didn't see it as a war that was ultimately directed against them as well. So in the context of this presentation, I will look at whether my positions have been validated over time, and most importantly, whether they have gained greater understanding among the political leaders of the West, as well as in Russia and Ukraine. I will also discuss how that understanding itself can influence and may be critically important for the final outcome of this war. So I start with different factors which I mentioned in the beginning. First of all, Ukraine's army and Ukraine's war strategy. Let's start with this. Here we can see the situation has changed significantly. And fewer people now say that Russia's victory is certain. Ukraine has done many important things in developing a new strategy that has helped it stand against Russia, and that I believe will eventually help it win this war. The first major development was drones. Drones changed this war completely, and Ukraine was very smart and sophisticated both in using drones and in developing its own. To understand the importance of drones, we can recall the well-known children's game, rock, paper, scissors. Scissors cut paper, rock breaks scissors, but paper covers rock. What is important is that it creates a closed circle or closed cycle. In a certain sense, military strategy and military weapons can be described in a similar way. You need a closed cycle of different weapons. This may be tanks, missiles, air defense system, airplanes, and so on, but eventually for every weapon in a war, there should be another weapon capable of destroying or neutralizing it. Otherwise, warfare becomes completely asymmetric. If one weapon completely dominates and there is no effective counter weapon, the side possessing it can dominate the battlefield. What was important about drones is that they disrupted the traditional circle of military strategy. They represented a fundamentally new type of weapon that changed many of the previous equations of warfare. Drones could destroy or disable virtually every kind of traditional military equipment, including even the strongest tanks, while at the same time they were difficult and disproportionately expensive to counter. They were also relatively cheap and could therefore be produced in enormous quantities. Gradually, technology developed further and further. Ukraine has produced not thousands but millions of drones, including longer-range drones capable of operating not only on front line but deep behind Russian lines, inflicting significant damage. And eventually, Ukraine developed drones capable of striking far inside Russia. And that leads to the second critical change in Ukraine's strategy. For a long time, the war was largely confined to Ukrainian territory. But Ukraine eventually began attacking targets inside Russia, farther and farther away from Ukraine. I would say that this represented a dramatic change in the war for several reasons. First, it was completely unexpected by Putin. He did not expect that the war he started against Ukraine would be brought onto Russian territory. Second, Russians themselves started to feel the war directly. Before that, many people had largely ignored it, particularly in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other large cities, because they did not feel the war at all. Putin avoided mobilization from those places, and their populations remained relatively insulated from the war. But then Ukrainian drones began reaching Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other large cities, and people could see and experience the war with their own eyes. Those drones also created significant economic problems for Russia. that are experienced by people throughout the country. In particular, Ukraine managed to destroy or damage many oil refineries, created shortages of gasoline across Russia. Gasoline became very expensive, and in some places it was simply unavailable. So in this sense, the war is now being felt by people throughout the country. The drone attacks inside Russia also had a significant military effect because they have destroyed or damaged many military facilities, ports, and other important targets. So that has been a significant development. Another important change in Ukraine's strategy was decision to try to win the war of attrition, because that's essentially what this war has become. At first, this could look as an impossible task because Russia has a clear advantage both in manpower and in weapons. But Ukraine has set the goal of using drones to maximum effect and has established a target of eliminating through death and wounds 50,000 Russian troops per month. This is a very ambitious goal. But Ukraine has already achieved a level of more than 30,000 per month, and that level exceeds the number of troops that Russia can replenish. So if Ukraine can maintain this effectiveness, and particularly if it can reach its target of 50,000, the Russian army would become smaller and smaller every month. Paradoxically, therefore, Ukraine may have a chance to win the war of attrition. These are very important developments and have already dramatically changed the situation on the battlefield. At this moment, it is virtually a stalemate. Russia is moving like a snail, very slowly, taking some territory, while Ukraine has also taken back some territory. What is more important is that every additional kilometer of territory taken by Russia costs Russia more and more lives. So territorial gains are becoming increasingly expensive. In terms of any measure of efficiency, if I can use such term when speaking about human lives, it becomes increasingly counterproductive for Russia to take additional territory at such enormous cost. Here we see directly, very well known in economy, the law of diminishing return. And when companies experience such diminishing returns, it stops expanding because it becomes very inefficient. So these are significant change and significant successes in Ukraine's war strategy. Now, what happens in Ukraine as a country and its Ukrainian society? What happens with its people in general, not only its soldiers? The country remains very strong. It stands firm in its will and readiness to resist the Russian invasion and to remain in this war as long as necessary. At the same time, the everyday life of people is actually not as bad as one might expect during such war, except for ongoing risk of being killed by Russian missiles and drones. Ukraine has enough food and many other necessities, so people, including pensioners and others, are not suffering economically to the extent that might have been expected. This is definitely to a great extent thanks to assistance from the West and particularly mainly from Europe. The main immediate problem for people in Ukraine is the shortage of air defense systems. The Patriot system, which worked effectively for a long time, no longer have sufficient missiles. Unfortunately, this has left Ukraine cities increasingly exposed to Russian missile attacks, and Russia still has the large numbers of these missiles, and they are extremely destructive. In recent attacks on Kyiv, for example, Ukraine was unable to shoot down incoming missiles, and the number of casualties became much larger than before. The number of casualties of deaths has also increased in major Russian attacks, not only on Kyiv, but also on Dnieper, Kharkiv, Odessa, and other large cities. So at this moment, it's probably one of Ukraine's main problem, if not the main immediate problem. The urgent need of additional air defense systems, particularly Patriot systems and missiles for them. Unfortunately, the United States used a very large number of expensive air defense missiles during the conflict with Iran against drones, which was not necessarily the most efficient use of that equipment. Ukraine have offered the United States and the Middle Eastern countries anti-drone drones, which are much cheaper and can be very effective in shooting down attacking drones. Instead, large numbers of expensive interceptor missiles were used. Some politicians say that the shortage of those Patriot missiles now is due mainly to previous help to Ukraine. But it's not true. Ukraine altogether received about 600 Patriot missiles, while during the conflict with Iran, approximately 2,400 missiles were used in a very short period, 4 times as many as Ukraine received over entire period of war. So this is a very serious situation. Hopefully European countries, perhaps Middle Eastern countries, and eventually the United States can help Ukraine obtain additional air defense systems and missiles. Now about Ukraine domestic politics and its leaderships. And there are many developments in Ukrainian politics, including changes among the country's political and military leadership made by Zelensky. Some of the decisions I would not call particularly wise. For example, he removed the apparently very talented and successful defense minister Fedorov, because Fedorov couldn't find common ground with Commander-in-Chief Syrsky, who represented an older generation. Zelensky first decided to remove Fedorov, but then approximately 10 days later, he also removed Syrsky. After dismissing Syrsky, Zelensky appointed the young General Drapati as Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian army. Drapati is actually a good friend of Fedorov, so the whole reason for dismissing Fedorov became obsolete. But I am not sure that Zelensky would return Fedorov to his position, perhaps because of political or personal ambitions. And that is a problem, because what we see with Zelensky is a situation that is typical of leaders who remain in incredibly difficult and tense situation for a very long period of time. We usually observe a kind of leadership fatigue in which such leaders gradually start to make more mistakes. We saw it even with Winston Churchill. We definitely see it with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, and we can partially see it now with Zelensky. And this is a two-way street. A person who stays in power and particularly exercises very strong power for a long period of time under extremely difficult circumstances inevitably starts to make some mistakes. But there is also a kind of fatigue on the side of the people. Even when a leader does most things correctly and courageously, people simply become tired of strong leadership of the crisis and of living under constant pressure. We saw this with Winston Churchill in Britain. At the end of the Second World War, he had virtually saved Britain and accomplished something close to a miracle. But when the war ended, people wanted something simpler and easier. They wanted a return to more normal life. The same effect gradually starts to be visible with Zelensky, although I do not think that at the moment it is a significant factor. Now about Russia and Putin's regime. The more important question now is what is happening in Russian politics and how strong Putin's power really is. Because the whole thing ultimately comes down to Putin's regime. The real victory of Ukraine is the fall of Putin's regime. And I believe that it eventually will happen. Are there already strong signs of this? It is very difficult to say. On the surface, Putin appears to have absolute power and to fully control the situation inside the country. Still, there are many cracks that can be already seen, both within the immediate surrounding and in the attitude of Russian people toward the war and his leadership. But I want to emphasize that such processes are highly nonlinear. They do not necessarily develop gradually. So I would not be surprised if at some point Putin's regime suddenly fell. That would completely change the situation in Ukraine war. But the timing of such event is one of the most difficult things to predict. Now about the West. There have also been important developments in the West. Definitely the most important has been Trump's return to power and his becoming increasingly distant from Ukraine, at some moments virtually taking Putin's side rather than Zelensky. He remains still ambivalent about the whole situation. He is now less supportive of Putin and shows more respect to Zelensky. But this has hardly translated into significant practical actions. And as I have said, Trump still applies a kind of moral equivalence in his attitude toward Russia and Ukraine. He still refuses to place the full guilt and responsibility for this war on Putin, and instead tries to act as an independent mediator between Russia and Ukraine. I believe that this is his fundamental mistake. Trump does not want to accept the fact that Putin himself states clearly and openly that this is a war against the United States and the West, first and foremost America. In such a situation, the United States cannot be an independent mediator between Russia and Ukraine. Its side is with Ukraine. And it was not the United States that chose that side. Putin chose it. Unfortunately, Trump still refuses to fully recognize this reality. There have been, however, some positive development, mainly as a result of Ukraine's successes on the battlefield. For a long time, Trump believed that Putin was decisively winning this war and could achieve victory at almost any moment, virtually within several weeks. He did not want to see the other side of the situation, and much of his political calculation was based on the assumption that Putin had the upper hand and therefore should be offered significant concessions. Gradually, Trump seems to be losing this belief in Putin's strength. He increasingly appears to recognize that Zelensky's position is much stronger than he previously believed, and this is not a one-sided war. That should certainly have some influence on his political calculations. Europe, meanwhile, remains quite strong in its support for Ukraine in general and quite consolidated, with few exceptions. The worst of them was Orban in Hungary, but he is gone. Fiza in Slovakia still presents some obstacle to support Ukraine, and there is now also a new Bulgarian president who creates additional difficulties. But both represent my weaker obstacles than Orban did. Overall, therefore, I think the European situation is improving, and Europe remains quite strong in its support for Ukraine. Unfortunately, there are certain things that Europe cannot do without the United States. So many important developments still depend on Trump. And finally, I would come to most important, the global dimension. But first, let me summarize what I have said so far. My first statement was that Ukraine would win this war. Very few people believed this at the outset of the war. But this prediction has now gone through several years of testing and has not been repudiated. I still believe it, and I think many more people believe it today than believed it at the beginning. And that belief, or more precisely, that understanding, has a very significant influence on the policy of Western leaders toward Ukraine. Unfortunately, Putin himself still strongly believes that he is winning, and that remains a very negative factor. Now, let's get to global dimension of this war and to my second position, which concerns geopolitics. As I said from the very beginning, I believed, and I still believe, that this war is part of the global ideological war between the united totalitarian bloc and the free world. The totalitarian bloc, which includes, along with Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, is waging its war against the free world and, as I said, first and foremost against the United States. The war in Ukraine is a classical proxy war within this global ideological war. Not daring to attack the United States directly, the totalitarian country, and first and foremost Russia, attacks its democratic ally, Ukraine. This is extremely important for understanding the whole situation, because the strategy and policy of the United States, Europe, and Ukraine itself depends on recognizing this reality. This understanding was not widely accepted at the beginning and of this war, and it's still denied by some people, including, unfortunately, some people in Ukraine, who continue to see this simply as a local war between Ukraine and Russia, and do not recognize its broader geopolitical context. But more and more people are beginning to understand it because they can no longer ignore the accumulating facts that support this position. First of all, war was preceded by agreements among the countries which I have mentioned: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, agreements of mutual support and cooperation. But then we began to see much more specific action demonstrating the unity of totalitarian bloc and showing that this war is not simply a separate war by Russia. At the very beginning of the war, Iran supplied Russia with large numbers of Shahed drones. More importantly, Iran also helped Russia establish factory to manufacture these drones. Mind you, Russia didn't have a significant drone capability at the beginning of the war, so that was extremely important support provided by Iran to Russia. The second development, which was even more evident, was direct participation of North Korean troops in this war. North Korea has continued to provide with personnel and has also supplied large quantities of missiles and other weapons to Russia. China also supports Russia it tries to do it more clandestinely, but the support is nevertheless important, particularly in technology, more than electronics, components, and chips that Russia needs for the production of missiles, drones, and other weapons. And politically, China, Iran, and North Korea have consistently remained on Russia's side. In return, we can see now what is happening with Iran. And this provides additional evidence of the same relationship. We know that Russia has helped Iran with intelligence relevant to attacks on American military bases and other targets in the Middle East. We know that Russia and probably North Korea has provided military assistance to Iran in its confrontation with the United States. And most importantly, we know that Russia has helped Iran for many years in developing its nuclear program. So this bloc is consolidated and united against us. What is most important to recognize this situation is to see what is happening before our own eyes and to draw proper conclusions. We should approach the wars that are taking place today not simply as separate local wars, but as a different fronts in a broader struggle between the united totalitarian bloc and the free world. One, we understand the situation this way. The first strategic question is obvious. What is the weakest link in this bloc? And because if we succeed in one place, if we achieve a decisive victory on one front of this war, we will weaken the entire bloc and all countries within it while strengthening our ability to act more decisively elsewhere. As I said from the very beginning and continues to say, the weakest link in this bloc is Russia. Russia has demonstrated this weakness in the war in Ukraine. It has shown its army is not nearly as strong as many people believe, while the Ukrainian army has proved to be remarkably strong. Therefore, there is a real possibility of defeating Russia in this war. And the consequences of such defeat would be critical far beyond Ukraine. I would put it this way. The road to resolving our conundrum with Iran, the road to victory over Iran, Iranian totalitarian regime, goes through Kyiv. It is much easier to help Ukraine with strong army and its determination to win this war, and thereby bring about collapse of Putin regime, than to deal directly with the Iranian regime, which at this moment remains relatively strong. But a Ukrainian victory and the collapse of Putin regime would have a tremendous effect on Iran. It would significantly weaken the position and resolve of Ukrainian totalitarian regime, while greatly increasing the morale and strengthening the Iranian opposition. And it is possible that without major military action afterward, we could help bring about the collapse of Ukrainian regime in much the same way as the West helped create the conditions for the collapse of the Soviet communism. So this is one critical dimension for both for the understanding of the situation and the winning the war in Ukraine, and beyond Ukraine for defeating the Iranian totalitarian regime and significantly weakening China. We have to see these countries as one united totalitarian bloc. We have to recognize Russia as its weakest link and concentrate our efforts on this front, provide maximum support to Ukraine, recognize that Putin is our principal enemy in this war, and understand that the Putin regime must ultimately be defeated. The consequence of such victory would go, as I said, far beyond Ukraine. They would have a significant effect on Iranian totalitarian regime and even on China's totalitarian regime. At the same time, they would significantly strengthen the democratic bloc and improve its ability to proceed further against the global totalitarian threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yarim-Agaev. This was a great digest and very, very uplifting, optimistic predictions. And if anyone has any questions, please. As people are thinking, my first question would be, please elaborate at least briefly on China.
Well, China is a leader of totalitarian bloc. It has a communist regime, which appears to be very strong so far. But I am a student of totalitarian ideology and communist regime, and I observe patterns of development of those regimes, and they are very similar in China and in the Soviet Union, shifted by approximately 30 years, simply because Chinese communism came into power about 30 years after Bolsheviks came to power in Russia. So if we compare those patterns, we'll see that China is now somewhere in the period of approaching the period already is in the period of Brezhnev's stagnations, which characterizes the gradual decrease and weakening of its economy, but more importantly, significant weakening of its ideology, which is the main factor supports such communist regimes. And we know what happened after Brezhnev's stagnation in Russia. So I think actually Chinese regime becomes weaker and weaker in every day. And any factors, external factors, which would weaken totalitarian bloc in general, any victory over Putin's regime in Russia or Iranian regime would have a significant effect on Chinese communist regime and strengthen its dissident movement, which is quite strong, but definitely strongly suppressed. So I would assume that if we you choose the same strategy as Reagan used with respect to the Soviet Union to China, the strategy of peaceful offensive, it can have the same effect as we had with the Soviet Union. And defeats of its closest totalitarian allies, such as Russia and Iran, would definitely accelerate this process.
Thank you. Thank you for this insight. Leslie, please. Leslie? Yes.
Yes, you talked about Trump's view of the war. One thing that I think might be interesting is looking at Putin, or at least Russia's view of America and how much of a factor it even is in the war at this point, because I've heard a BBC report that before Trump took office again, there was, of course, a lot of anti-American propaganda on Russian quote-unquote news channels. But since Trump took office, a lot of that anti-American propaganda has gone away and been replaced by anti-European and especially anti-British propaganda. They've taken, well, there's this Russian phrase, which I'm not going to attempt to say in the original Russian, but they quite frequently use a phrase that dates back to the Soviet Union, and I think even back to like the time around the Russian Civil War of the British woman is doing the dirty, or something like that. And that doing the dirty phrase has a double meaning of either defecation, which is pretty disgusting, or subversion and undermining something. Basically, this idea that Britain is always trying to undermine Russia because Britain and Russia are some kind of natural rivals or something, and they have, I think, Dmitry Medvedev, who took over as president of Russia for a few years when Putin was taking a little break. he posted something on his social media, or maybe this was something they said on one of the Russian news channels about Britain will sink beneath the waves due to our great Russian weapons or something like that. So I think you could talk about whether or not you think that indicates that maybe Russia is kind of given up on thinking that America is even really a factor in this war, and now they think that they only really have to contend with Europe.
Okay. We need to distinguish tactical and strategic things and ideology and propaganda. And that's important to understand. Ideologically, as far as long as America remains the strongest capitalist country, no matter of what are specific leaders, it remains enemy number one for both Russia, China, Iran. It's part of the ideology, because its ideology predicts global ideological war against freedom and capitalism, and as long as America, as I say, remains the most free and prosperous capitalist country, it remains enemy number one. And actually this war, as Putin stated himself, was directed, as well as Iran, as we know. For Iran, America is still great Satan. Also, it attacks Israel, but Israel is small Satan, and great Satan is still America. So ideologically and strategically, the situation doesn't change. Tactically and in terms of propaganda, it definitely varies, because Soviets, sorry, Russians, but virtually the same as Soviets with Putin, they hope to appease Trump somehow, not to irritate him much, so they a little bit slowed down some anti-American propaganda while Trump was president. But it's purely tactical and propaganda still. And they definitely increase their propaganda against Europe, because Europe is now the main force which supports Ukraine. So, but again, don't let's not confuse ideology with propaganda, and strategy and tactics. Strategically and ideologically, America remains enemy number one.
Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. Please, any more questions or comments? I have plenty of my own as we are approaching the hour, but we definitely have. We thank Dr. Yarim-Agaev for some more. I was intrigued to ask you about the consequences of possible consequences of upcoming midterm elections, because all international movements seem to be kind of timed or delayed concerning possible shift in the power in U.S. Congress. What do you think might happen in November and after this?
The simple answer is it's most probably that the Congress will become democratic, and Senate is still questionable, and probably will remain Republican. But it doesn't say much. So if this happens, it will be more lame duck situation for Trump's last 2 years, and it cannot change dramatically the political situation in Ukraine, with Ukraine, because I think it will be more stalemate. It still would depend on Trump, because if Trump's actually the Republican Congress, which is now, would vote for support of Ukraine if Trump decides so, as we know. Democratic Congress would probably vote for Ukraine simply because it would vote for it anyway. But without Trump's decision, not much can happen in this situation because he will still have the last word. So midterm elections are very important, but from other point of view, to me, particularly with increase of this extreme forces on both sides, but particularly on the left. And that's what really bothers me. And mind you, again, this is a thing which neither Trump nor MAGA's Republicans don't understand. The left inside America, the communists, and there are communists, many of them, and Islamists and other parts of the, let's say, totalitarian forces, which is correct word for those things. They are the stronger external totalitarian forces are. They are very much correlated. The stronger is China, the stronger is Iran, the stronger is Russia, and the weaker is the West with respect to them, the stronger feel those totalitarian forces inside our country. The stronger we become, the weaker becomes the totalitarian external bloc, the weaker become those forces. And we saw it with the collapse of the Soviet communism. I don't know whether some people remember it or not, but when the Soviet communists collapsed, American radical left virtually disappeared for several years. They hid, they were afraid to show up. But when the totalitarianism in some years started to rise again, as China became stronger and stronger, and Putin came to power and started to restore totalitarianism in Russia. Iran became pretty strong. The totalitarian forces inside United States and inside Western Europe also came out of their hideouts and started to become more daring, more stronger, and we'll see those results. Unfortunately, we'll see it in this midterm elections. But that what neither Trump nor Vance nor MAGA Republicans actually don't understand it. They don't understand that if they support and like Putin, their position with respect to totalitarian forces inside America is very contradicting and weak, actually.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's hope that we will find some reasonable forces inside this country which can see it and influence.
Well,
the
they do
decisions.
exist. They need more courage and more decisiveness. That's what we see. And a lot depends on Democrats. Democrats should cut their radical left wing from their party. That would be the decisive change in American politics. And I hope that it would eventually happen. But so far, they don't have courage and decision to do that, and that's the most problematic thing now in American politics. And mind you, if they cut the extreme left wing in their party, the extreme, not that extreme, I believe, but still far right forces on the Republican party would weaken significantly too, because actually they gain their strength only because the radical left gains their strength, because no one else resists to it, and that's why they became stronger and stronger.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this analysis and for your insights. We will be delighted to see you again when things change, and hopefully we can say something more. But thank you again for your participation and trust.
Thank you. I hope we may
wish you well.
celebrate. I hope we may celebrate together Ukraine's victory and quite soon. That's my hope, and
Yes.
I hope it will happen.
Thank you very much, and we wish well to all our viewers who will see this recording. This was Marshall University, MUkraine discussion group, week 232. Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, Героям слава.
Slava
Thank you.
Ukraine.
Героям слава.